All right, get ready, because today we're diving into something that might seem a little strange at first: strategic surrender.
Uh-oh.
I know, right? It sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah, how can giving up possibly lead to winning?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Okay.
We're looking at Law 22 from Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power.
Oh, yeah, I love that book.
And two. And this law is all about using what appears to be weakness and turning it into an advantage.
Interesting.
Yeah, by using surrender as a calculated move,
Yeah.
not just giving up.
Okay, so not a white flag waving kind of thing.
Not at all. More like a strategic maneuver.
Yeah.
And to help us really wrap our heads around this, we have our expert here. What do you think about this approach to power?
Well, it's super interesting. It really flips the script on how we usually think about strength and winning.
Right. It's like a totally different way of looking at things.
Yeah. Strategic surrender basically says that sometimes, maybe you step back for a little bit, and that can actually put you in a better spot to get what you want in the end.
Okay. I like it. Playing the long game.
It is. It is.
But before we go too far, let's make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
When we're saying surrender here,
Uh-huh.
we're not talking about just totally throwing in the towel.
No, not at all.
Right.
We're talking about a deliberate, thought-out move.
Yeah.
It's like being smart about which fights you pick, saving your energy, and maybe even letting your opponent think they've won too soon.
Oh, that's good. That misdirection.
Oh, yeah, that's where it gets powerful.
So I'm starting to see the potential here. But to really get how this works, I think it helps to look at a real-life example.
Sure.
And what comes to mind for me is Napoleon's Russian campaign back in 1812.
Ah, yes, a classic case.
Can you break that down for us?
Well, Napoleon, he was known for being ambitious, a brilliant military mind, but he kind of stumbled over this whole strategic surrender thing.
Really? How so?
Well, the Russians, they were clever. Instead of going head-to-head with Napoleon's forces, they decided to retreat strategically. And not just retreat, they burned everything as they went.
Whoa, like a scorched earth policy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They destroyed their own villages, supplies, anything Napoleon's troops could use.
Wow. That must have been incredibly frustrating for Napoleon.
Absolutely. He would march deeper and deeper into Russia, thinking he was winning, but his supply lines were getting stretched thinner and thinner.
Oh,
His army was losing morale. And then winter hit.
the brutal Russian winter.
Exactly. And that's what the Russians were counting on. They lured Napoleon into a trap by seemingly giving up their land.
So what looked like a Russian defeat was actually a really smart move.
Oh, yeah. It crippled Napoleon's army and really contributed to his downfall.
That is a perfect example of Law 22 in action.
It really is.
It's not about brute force, it's about choosing when and where to fight.
You got it.
So we've seen how it works in a military sense, but I'm thinking now, how does this principle play out in social and political movements? And Mahatma Gandhi immediately comes to mind.
Oh, Gandhi is a fantastic example.
Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So India's fight for independence from Britain. Gandhi, he knew going up against the British military directly would be a disaster.
Yeah, that's a losing battle from the start.
Right. So instead, he chooses nonviolent resistance.
But wasn't there a risk that would be seen as weakness?
Of course, there's always that risk. But Gandhi was a master at what he did.
Okay.
By refusing to meet violence with violence, he exposed how brutal the British Empire really was, and the whole world saw it.
So his surrender, so to speak, actually forced the British to face the consequences of their actions.
Exactly. It flipped the power dynamic.
Amazing.
And it shifted public opinion. People started supporting India's independence. So Gandhi showed that strategic surrender, it's not passive. It can create massive social and political change.
That's incredible. So now I'm thinking about surrender as a form of psychological warfare. It sounds a little intense.
Oh, it can be.
Is that something you can talk more about?
Absolutely. Think about it. When you appear to surrender, your opponent, they start to relax. They think they've won.
Right. They let their guard down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, bam, you use that overconfidence against them.
Oh, that's sneaky.
It's a classic case of strategic deception.
Yeah.
You make them think they're in control, but you're actually pulling the strings.
Ah, makes a lot of sense. So are there any businesses today that have used this strategic surrender effectively? Any examples that come to mind?
Oh, there are plenty.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that really stands out is Netflix.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. They were up against giants, Disney Plus, 2, HBO Max, these huge established companies.
It was like David and Goliath, right?
Totally. But instead of trying to compete head-to-head with everything, Netflix got smart.
What did they do?
They looked at where the other companies were really strong, like Disney, with family content.
Right, that's their bread and butter.
Exactly. So Netflix thought, why waste our energy on a losing battle?
Makes sense.
Instead, they focused on what they did best, creating their own shows and movies.
Original content.
Yeah, and that's how they became the streaming giant they are today.
So by choosing their battles, they actually came out on top.
They did. They did.
This is really fascinating. We've gone from military strategy to social movements to business.
Yeah, the principle applies everywhere.
It really does.
Yeah.
But now I want to bring it home.
Yeah.
How can we, like everyday people, use this idea of strategic surrender in our own lives?
That's the key question, right?
Yeah, like how do we take this big concept and actually make it work for us?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing when fighting back is just not going to work.
So knowing when to hold back, when to push forward, how do we know which is which?
It takes practice. But you got to be honest with yourself about your chances of winning.
Okay.
If you're facing a situation, where you're clearly outmatched, the odds are stacked against you, sometimes the smartest thing to do is step back and reassess.
So not fighting can actually be a way of being in control.
Exactly. You save your energy, your resources for when you have a better shot at winning.
That makes a lot of sense. But can you give us some real-life examples?
Of course.
Like, say, in a conflict at work.
Sure. Imagine you're in a big disagreement with a coworker, maybe about how to do a project.
Happens all the time.
Right. If you dig in your heels and insist on only your way, you could really damage the relationship, and the project might suffer too.
Yeah, it just creates more problems.
Exactly.
So how would strategic surrender work in that situation?
Instead of fighting every single point, try surrendering on the little things.
The less important stuff.
Right. It can help to calm things down and create a more cooperative environment.
So you might feel like you're giving something up, but in the long run, it's better for everyone.
It is. It is.
And I bet this same idea could be applied to negotiations too.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Negotiations are all about strategy.
Sure.
If you go in thinking, I have to win no matter what,
Yeah.
you're basically setting yourself up for a fight.
It's like an adversarial situation.
Exactly.
It doesn't really feel like a negotiation anymore.
Right. But if you're willing to concede on a few things, the less critical points, you can build trust with the other person.
Yeah.
You show them you're willing to compromise, and that can actually lead to a better outcome for both of you.
So it's about strategically giving up smaller things to gain an advantage in the bigger picture.
Got it.
This is really making sense. But is there a risk, like, if you surrender too often, people will think you're weak?
That's a good question.
How do you walk that line?
It's all about being intentional. You're not surrendering out of fear or weakness. You're doing it with a purpose.
So how do you decide when to yield and when to stand your ground?
Well, for example, if you're dealing with someone who has more power than you,
Mm-hmm.
maybe surrendering on certain points buys you some time.
Okay.
You can gather more information, build a stronger case later on.
It's like a temporary retreat.
Exactly. You're playing the long game. Sometimes stepping back is the best way to move forward.
Now, I know Robert Greene talks about the dangers of surrendering too often. Can you explain that a little?
Yes, he does. If you're always surrendering, every time there's a challenge, people will start to think you can't make decisions.
Like you're a pushover.
Exactly. And that can hurt your credibility. People won't take you seriously.
That makes sense. So it's not about being a doormat. It's about choosing your moments.
Right. You have to be smart about it.
Now, can we look at an example where surrender wasn't used strategically and things went wrong?
Oh, sure.
What comes to mind?
Well, Byzantine Empire. They were around for a long time, but they eventually collapsed.
What happened?
They faced a lot of threats over the centuries. And often, they decided to surrender territory or pay off their enemies to avoid conflict.
So like appeasement.
Right. But they didn't really have a plan for getting back what they lost. And over time, all those surrenders weakened them, and it played a part in their downfall.
So they surrendered without a bigger strategy.
Exactly. They lost sight of the long game.
That's really insightful.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just surrender. You need to have a vision for what comes next.
Got it.
This has been eye-opening. I'm starting to see this concept in a whole new light.
Good.
It's not about weakness. It's about being strategic, adaptable, and knowing when to yield. What do you think about that?
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Great.
It really expands our understanding of what power truly is.
I like that. So as we keep digging into this idea of strategic surrender,
Uh-huh.
I want to make sure we talk about the fact that surrendering isn't always a bad thing.
That's right.
Like sometimes surrendering gracefully can actually earn you respect.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you talk more about that?
Think about it. If you know you're going to lose, but you handle it with dignity and composure, you're showing self-awareness, control.
Hmm.
That can actually make people admire you more.
So, knowing when to step back from a losing battle, that takes strength.
It does. It's about knowing your limits and choosing your battles.
And I imagine that can lead to new opportunities you might not have seen before.
Oh, definitely.
Right.
Yeah. Let's look at Nelson Mandela. He was in prison for 27 years,
Wow, a long
a
time.
very long time. But during that time, he chose to engage with his captors in a way that was both respectful and strategic.
He didn't compromise his principles, but he didn't meet anger with anger.
Exactly. He understood that resistance in that situation wouldn't get him anywhere.
So he chose a different path.
He did. He built relationships with the guards, studied law, and kept advocating for what he believed in. And he earned their respect, even for the people who imprisoned him.
And that ultimately paved the way for his release and his role in the transition to a democratic South Africa.
It did. It did.
Yeah.
Mandela's story shows that even in the toughest situations, surrendering in the right way can lead to more power and influence.
It's a powerful example.
It is.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from historical examples to the idea of surrender as a psychological tactic. But I think the most important thing is, how do we apply this in our everyday lives?
I agree.
And that's exactly what we're going to delve into next.
Looking forward to it.
Into.
It's not about, always being the loudest or the strongest.
Mm-hmm.
It's about knowing when to step back,
Yeah.
when to kind of let things unfold,
Right, right.
and ultimately, using that to your advantage.
So we've talked about, history and some big ideas,
Yeah.
but let's get practical.
Sure.
How can people listening actually use this in their lives?
Okay, so one of the toughest things for people is dealing with conflict,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether it's at work, with family, even in relationships.
Yeah, those can get heated.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And our first instinct is usually to fight back, defend ourselves.
It's like that fight or flight response kicking in.
It is, it is. But that's exactly when strategic surrender becomes super important.
Okay, so in those heated moments, that's when we need it most.
Exactly. Think
Yeah.
about a time when you were arguing with someone and it just kept escalating.
Oh, I've been there.
And did you notice that the more you dug in your heels, the worse it got?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It rarely ends well. But how do you actually use strategic surrender when you're in that emotional state?
It's tough, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
But that's where the real power of this idea comes in.
Okay.
It's not about ignoring your feelings or letting people walk all over you.
Ugh.
It's about taking a breath,
Okay.
stepping back from that intensity,
Right.
and asking yourself, what am I really trying to achieve here?
So it's about the bigger picture.
It is. Is winning this argument worth damaging the relationship?
Right, right. Sometimes you got to pick your battles.
Exactly. Sometimes letting go of that need to be right, that's the smartest move you can make.
Okay, so can we make this even more concrete? Like, give us a real example of how this could play out.
Okay, imagine you're working on a project with a colleague,
Uh-huh.
and you have totally different ideas about how to do it.
Happens all the time at work.
Right. Deadline's approaching, everyone's stressed.
Yeah.
You could insist on your way.
Which probably wouldn't go over well.
Probably not. It could create a huge power struggle, damage the relationship, and the project might fail.
Nobody wants that.
Right. So instead, try this. What if you approached it as a collaboration?
Okay.
Maybe your colleague has a good point you hadn't considered.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's a way to combine both of your ideas and come up with something even better.
That's a good point.
By being open to compromise, surrendering on some of the smaller things,
Okay.
you can actually build a better working relationship.
So it's not about giving in entirely. It's about, like you said, strategic surrender.
Exactly. You're choosing your battles,
Yeah.
focusing on what really matters.
And sometimes that means letting go of the need to always be right.
Sometimes, yeah.
It's a tough one, but I see how it can be really effective.
It can be. And remember, it's not just about giving in to other people.
Oh, okay.
You can also surrender to the situation itself.
What do you mean by that?
Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, there are things we just can't control.
Life throws curveballs.
It does. We can fight against it, get all stressed out,
Mm-hmm.
or we can accept what is.
Surrender to the reality of the situation.
Exactly. And when you do that, you can actually focus your energy on what you can control.
That's a good point. It's like that saying, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change.
Yes. The courage to change the things I can and the wisdom to know the difference.
It's about knowing your limits.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of freedom in that, in letting go of that need to control everything.
It's like you're choosing peace over stress.
Exactly.
So we've talked about conflict,
Uh-huh.
but where else can we apply this idea of strategic surrender?
Hmm. Well, what about creativity?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Think about a jazz musician improvising a solo.
Okay.
They know the rules, the scales, the chords.
Just structure.
Right. But it's when they let go, when they surrender to the flow of the music.
That's when the magic happens.
Exactly.
It's like a dance between structure and freedom.
It is. It is. Too much control, and the
Oh.
music's boring.
Right.
Too much freedom, and it's just noise.
So you got to find that balance.
That's the sweet spot.
And this idea of surrendering to the process, I bet it applies to personal growth too.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
So much of personal growth is about letting go of limiting beliefs, fears.
Like that inner critic.
Exactly. It's about being open to new experiences, even when they challenge us.
Being open to the unknown.
Yes. And that can be uncomfortable,
Definitely.
but it's where real growth happens.
This is amazing. We've gone from conflict to creativity to personal growth, and this idea of strategic surrender ties it all together.
It's a powerful concept.
It is. But it sounds like it takes a lot of work, a lot of self-awareness.
It does. It does. It's a skill you develop over time,
Yeah.
and it's not always going to be easy,
Right.
but the rewards are worth it.
Okay, so we've talked about the good stuff, but what about the downsides?
Sure.
What are some of the risks of strategic surrender?
Well, one of the biggest dangers is surrendering too often,
Okay.
or surrendering without a clear reason.
Like not having a strategy,
Exactly. If you're always giving in, people will start to see you as weak.
a pushover.
Right.
Yeah.
And they might not respect your decisions.
So there's a difference between strategic surrender and just being a doormat. Huge difference. We need to be intentional about it.
Absolutely. And you also got to think about the consequences.
Okay.
Are you giving up something that's really important to you? Are you compromising your values?
That's a good point. We need to be aware of those things.
We do.
Now, are there any historical examples that show what can happen when surrender is misused?
Oh, yeah, plenty.
What comes to mind?
The Roman Empire.
Oh, wow. The Roman Empire, they were so powerful.
They were, but they faced a lot of pressure from outside forces.
Okay.
And sometimes they made deals with their enemies, giving them land or money in exchange for peace.
So, like appeasement again.
Yeah, kind of. And while it might have seemed like a good idea at the time, it actually weakened them in the long run.
So they were trying to avoid conflict, but it backfired.
It did. They didn't address the root problems, and eventually it led to their downfall.
That's a good lesson. Strategic surrender isn't about just giving in to avoid conflict.
Right.
It's about being smart, knowing when to yield, but also having a plan for getting back on top.
Exactly. You have to be proactive, not reactive.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential downsides, but I think it's also important to remember that sometimes surrendering gracefully can actually be a sign of strength.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It takes courage to admit defeat,
Yeah,
to walk away with your head held high.
it shows character.
It does. It's
Uh,
about learning from your losses and coming back stronger.
And sometimes surrendering can even open up new doors, opportunities you never expected.
Oh, definitely. Think about Miyamoto Musashi, the famous Japanese swordsman.
Okay, I've heard of him.
Legend has it, he was challenged to a duel by a younger, less skilled swordsman.
Okay.
But instead of fighting him head-on, Musashi just stepped aside as the guy charged.
So the younger guy just fell into the water.
Yep. And Musashi won without even drawing his sword.
Wow.
He knew that a direct fight would be pointless. He would have won, but what would it have achieved?
Right.
This way, he saved his energy and taught the younger guy a lesson about humility.
That's brilliant. It's not about being weak, it's about being wise.
Exactly.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. We've covered so much.
We have.
So before we move on, is there one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that strategic surrender, it's not a magic solution.
Mm-hmm.
It's something you have to think about carefully, be self-aware,
Yeah.
and know how to adapt it to different situations.
So it's not about always surrendering or never surrendering.
Right. It's about finding that balance, knowing when to hold firm and when to let go.
And that's something we can all work on.
It is. It is.
Well, this has been incredibly thought-provoking.
It has.
And now I want to shift our focus inward. How can we apply this idea of strategic surrender To our own minds, our relationship with ourselves.
Ooh, that's a good one. I'm ready to dive into that.
So we've talked a lot about using strategic surrender out in the world,
Yeah.
right? Like with other people and arguments, negotiations, all that.
Right, right.
But now I'm kind of curious about how this works internally.
Internally.
Yeah, like in our own minds, how we deal with ourselves.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It's like we focused on those external battles,
Huh.
but what about the battles we have going on inside?
Ooh, that's a good point. We often forget about those, don't we?
I think so. All those anxieties, those doubts,
Yeah.
that constant pressure to be perfect.
It's exhausting.
It really is. And it can keep us from feeling happy, content.
It can, for sure.
So what if, instead of resisting all those internal struggles,
Yeah.
we tried surrendering to them?
That's an interesting thought. We can't control everything, right?
Right.
Not even our own thoughts and feelings.
Sure.
Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just say, okay, this is how it is.
Accept it.
Accept it. Surrender to the flow of things.
So like with anxiety, for example,
Yeah.
instead of freaking out, we could try to just be aware of it
Acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Say, hey, anxiety, I see you there.
and maybe even try to understand where it's coming from.
Exactly. A lot of times anxiety is rooted in fear, fear of what might happen, fear of not being good enough.
The unknown.
The unknown.
Yeah.
Exactly. And when you face that fear, when you just sit with it,
Okay.
it starts to lose its power over you.
So we're not letting it control us.
We're not. We're creating space for it,
Mm-hmm.
but we're not letting it run the show.
And this internal surrender thing,
Yeah.
I bet it's helpful when things don't go our way.
Oh, absolutely.
Those disappointments, setbacks.
It's natural to resist those, right?
Yeah. Get angry, blame ourselves, blame others.
Yeah.
But what if instead of fighting against it,
Mm-hmm.
we just surrendered to the reality of the situation?
It's not about giving up.
Okay.
It's about accepting what is.
So we can move on.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
free up so much energy
Yeah.
when you stop fighting reality.
Makes sense. So it's not about dwelling on the negative.
No.
It's about acknowledging it
Mm-hmm.
and then looking for what we can learn from it,
Right.
how we can grow from it.
Exactly. Ask yourself, okay, what happened here? How can I do better next time?
So we're shifting our focus
We are.
from what went wrong
Mhm.
to what we can do next.
It's a much more empowering way to look at things.
I like that. It's not a failure, it's a learning opportunity.
Exactly.
And it reminds me, surrendering doesn't mean we give up on our dreams.
No, not at all.
It's more like letting go of trying to control every little thing.
Yeah. Trust the process,
Trusting the process.
even when it gets messy, even when it takes detours. You're exactly where you're supposed to be.
I love that. It takes the pressure off,
It does. It does.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most amazing things happen when we let go of our plans and just see where life takes us.
That's a good reminder. This has been such a great conversation.
It has.
We've learned so much about strategic surrender,
Mm,
from history to how it works in our lives, both externally and internally.
yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Law 22, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think the main thing is to remember that strategic surrender isn't weak.
Oh,
It's actually a really smart way to navigate life. It's about being flexible, adaptable,
yeah.
and willing to let go of those ideas we have about how things should be.
Well said. It's about finding that balance
Mm-hmm.
between effort and surrender,
Yes,
control and letting go.
it is.
It's a journey, really.
It is a lifelong journey.
And it can help us understand ourselves and the world around us so much better.
I think so too.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and remember the power of strategic surrender.
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure diving in with you.
Likewise. Until next time.